Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Georgia Domestic Violence Fatality Review Project's webinar on the 13th Annual Domestic Violence Fatality Review Report. I know that was a mouthful, but my name is Nikki Lemeshka, and I'm with the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. With me today is Jenny Asman, also from the Commission, who is graciously sitting in on this webinar for Taylor Tabb with the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, who has laryngitis today, but will still be with us, assisting us. She's going to be typing in the chat feature, answering questions as they come up, and will also be assisting with any sort of technical issues as they may come up. So before we start with the content of the webinar, I want to make sure that everyone can hear us loud and clear. If you can hear us, please use the control panel on the right side of your screen to click the hand icon. Clicking that button essentially raises your hand to let us know that you're able to hear us right now at this moment. Okay, starting to see some hands go up. While you're doing that, we want to go ahead and tell you that if any point during the webinar you're experiencing technical issues, either you lose connection to the webinar through your computer or you're having problems with the audio, the best resource for you to connect with that kind of support is at the webinar service provider that we use. You can contact the customer support by dialing 1-800-263-6317 or by going to support.gotomeeting.com. If you find that you're having difficulty with the audio, if it's cutting out or if it's choppy, the best audio connection will be if you dial in via telephone rather than using the internet connection to listen. Just as a reminder, all participants today are muted. If you have questions or comments for us, we'll encourage you to use the chat feature or the box on the right side of your screen in the control panel instead of raising your hand. Just type your question and hit submit. Taylor, Jenny, and I will be the only ones that can see your questions, and it's the quickest and easiest method to ask questions and we're going to do the best we can to accommodate everyone's question during the webinar today. One of the most frequently asked questions on webinars is whether or not we'll be sharing the PowerPoint slides. We will be sending those out after the webinar. So everyone who's connected to the webinar and logged in today will receive an email from us with the slides, also with an online evaluation to give us some quick feedback about the webinar today. That email could also be used as your documentation for your participation in the webinar, for your training records, as we're going to be unable to issue certificates for your attendance today. We would like to say a quick thank you to CJCC, the Administrating Office for the Stop Formula Grant Program, which funds this project. We appreciate CJCC for allowing us to bring you the webinar today. All right, so finally, before we start, we want to get a sense of who's participating in the webinar today. In the chat box, let us know what system you represent. Don't be shy, go ahead and type in. We have some suggestions here on the screen. All right. Great. It looks like we have lots of representation from DV programs, family violence intervention programs, and DCS officers. So the webinar filled up very quickly, and we're excited to have all of you with us today.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. This is Jenny Asman with the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. While many folks on the call today are familiar with the Georgia Domestic Violence Fatality Review Project, I want to just give a quick overview of our project and how we gather our data. The project is a joint initiative between the Georgia Commission on Family Violence and the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. The project began in 2004 and is led by two statewide coordinators, one from each agency, who are currently Taylor Tabb with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Nikki Lemeshka with the Commission on Family Violence. And over the past 13 years, we have worked with over 25 communities in the state to review 105 fatality and 7 near fatality cases. And every year we issue an annual report which contains charts, topical discussions, recommendations by system, which is distributed around the state. And so the webinar today will be an overview of the 13th annual report, which is the most recent report released by the project. And our goals of the webinar today are to take you through the report and give a high-level overview of the content, including some of our key findings and conclusions. If you haven't downloaded the report yet or received a hard copy in the mail, you can head over to georgiafatality.review.com. Right on our front page on that website is a place where you can download the PDF immediately or put in an order to have one mailed to you. And another goal that we have towards the end of the report, or excuse me, webinar today, we'll be giving you some ideas on how to use the report in your community and your local agencies, as well as in the task force that you're part of. And if you haven't heard yet and haven't seen the report yet, the theme of the report this year is the suicide-homicide connection and lethal domestic violence incidents. This theme is driven by the project's finding that 38% of perpetrators in reviewed cases attempted or completed suicide at the scene of the homicide or shortly thereafter. And further, fatality reviews revealed that 37% of perpetrators have threatened or attempted suicide in incidents which occurred prior to the homicide incident. So all of these incidents and findings that we have from our project represent missed opportunities to connect the dots between the perpetrator's suicidal thoughts and attempts and their use of violence in their relationship. So these findings, combined with the knowledge that a domestic violence abuser's level of depression as well as suicide threats and attempts are known to increase the risk of injury for intimate partners, children, and others, all culminated in the project taking a closer look at the incidents of murder-suicide in our state. So we've highlighted these findings in previous reports issued by the project. For those of you who have been following our project and reading our reports for several years may remember that in 2013, we highlighted the suicide connection as one of our top 10 key findings from the first 10 years of our project. And then in 2014, we highlighted in our report a suicide protocol for FIPS as well as a suicide protocol for advocates to integrate into their work with victims and abusers to address increased risk of domestic violence homicide for suicidal perpetrators. And then in our 2015 annual report, which was released last year, we focused on children exposed to domestic violence. But we had a specific section in the back of the report that highlighted murder-suicide and familicide trends in our state. And we specifically included that section because we started to see a trend in an increase in the number of murder-suicides being recorded in Georgia. And we wanted to take a closer look at those cases. So we made a request of our fatality review teams across the state to specifically engage in reviews of domestic violence-related murder-suicides and familicides in an effort to assist the project in expanding our understanding of these cases. And so in 2016, we had 6 fatality review teams review cases of murder-suicide and familicide, which added to about 30 other murder-suicide cases that had been reviewed previously with fatality review teams across the state. And so this year, what that allowed us to do and what we did as a project is we looked specifically at how the data collected from murder-suicide cases compares with data collected from cases which ended in homicide only. So essentially what we did is we created 2 pools of data. One which is what we're calling the murder-suicide data, and the other is our homicide data. And so we're comparing the data collected from these 2 different pools or types of cases, looking for trends and areas of data that differ significantly. And so as you read through the report and as we go through the webinar today, you'll hear us referring to murder-suicide data or cases versus homicide data or cases. And so that's how we split up the data, and that's sort of what that data means when we're talking about it. And the layout of the report looks pretty similar to past layouts, but what we really do is we focus on, again, those trends that we identified when we started comparing the data pools to each other. So that makes up the bulk of our report, and you'll see on the screen the 7 trends that we identified and decided to focus on in the report this year. The report does start out with an introduction, which really frames our work and frames why we're focusing on this, and includes some really interesting statistics on suicide in our state. Then we go into the 7 trends. We also include 3 stories of victims from cases that we've reviewed as a way of connecting the content of the report to the true stories and lived experiences of victims from reviewed cases, and as a way of honoring them and their lives that we lost through these tragedies. And then you'll also find in our report recommendations that are featured in each of the 7 trends that are highlighted, and a few special sections where we want to bring special attention to innovative projects, including a suicide prevention initiative, as well as an intervention for firearms, which involves engaging local gun shop owners. So you'll see that throughout our report as well. So the first trend that we go through and look at and examine in our report this year relates to relationship dynamics and tactics of abuse in reviewed cases ending in murder-suicide. Significantly, victims in murder-suicide cases were almost twice as likely as those in homicide cases to have been out of the relationship with the perpetrator at the time of the fatal incident. In cases where the victim was still in the relationship, in almost every case, there was an indication that the relationship dynamics were changing or shifting in some way. And often what we saw were these on-again, off-again dynamics that were existing in that relationship, where the couple was breaking up and getting back together, breaking up and getting back together, and still had this sort of ongoing dynamic that was occurring. And we explore in more detail in the report how this played out in some of the cases, which included how maybe the mental health of the perpetrator contributed to these dynamics. And we'll go a little bit more into that in the webinar today. So while most of us on the webinar today are aware that the most dangerous time for victims is when they're leaving their relationship, these reviewed cases and this finding that we found through this review of murder-suicide cases revealed the safety issues that continue to exist after a relationship has ended, and that oftentimes this risk extends up to years after the relationship has formally ended between a victim and a perpetrator of abuse. And this is especially true when perpetrators or abusers are suicidal. In the recommendation section of this section of the report, or trend in the report, we encourage incorporating advocacy beyond leaving principles and extending safety planning with victims, again, past this initial period of separation from an abuser. And we encourage anyone who's working with victims to integrate into their discussions how suicidal thoughts of the abuser and by the abuser may impact the victim's safety. Another interesting relationship dynamic that we saw when we were looking at these murder-suicide cases is that we found that perpetrators of murder-suicide accused the victims of having affairs in almost half of all of the cases that were reviewed. Interestingly, any evidence that the victim was actually having an affair was rarely uncovered. And more likely than not, this accusation by the abuser of a victim having an affair may be more connected to a victim's attempts to leave or separate from that relationship. And it might be more related to the perpetrator's loss of control over that victim, which prompted this belief or accusation that they were cheating on them. We explore a little bit more into this concept and refer to Neil Webscale's research. He refers to this dynamic as morbid jealousy, and so that's interesting. That's coming up in some other research as well. An additional trend in the relationship dynamics that we identified in the murder-suicide cases is that almost half of the cases the couple shared minor children. And so while some victims experience their abuser using children as a tool to manipulate or control them, the most common issue that we saw coming up for victims in these reviewed cases is the need or pressure to allow children to have contact and ongoing interaction with the abuser. And so we saw a mix of this. Sometimes it was court-ordered that this contact had to happen. Sometimes it was a mother wanting their child to continue to have a relationship with their father. But regardless, it was continued contact that was happening with the victim and the perpetrator, and oftentimes the only way that they continued to interact with one another or see each other, be in the presence of one another, or talk with one another, and it really put the victim at an increased risk of being further abused or manipulated by the abuser. So we explore the impact of this trend throughout the report because it comes up in a lot of our different sections, but really what we see is how this impacts child custody and child support. All right, additionally, another trend and findings related to tactics of abuse are highlighted in this section. We found that perpetrators of murder-suicide stalked the victim at a higher rate than in the homicide cases that were reviewed. So here's this chart. You'll see the red part of the chart is the murder-suicide data, and the gray part is from our homicide cases. And you'll see sort of how these start to compare. And so in many instances when we look through the cases and we're looking at the patterns of stalking or how stalking was coming up and what that looks like in these relationships, we saw that it oftentimes escalated after the victim separated from the abuser. This really speaks to control and jealousy in the relationship and is a red flag indicator of increased risk of lethal violence. And the stalking behavior doesn't have to be overtly threatening. It can also just be an abuser attempting to make contact again and again with the victim once she's ended that relationship and drawn a line or a boundary that he is not respecting and continues to try to make contact with that victim. It should always be taken seriously anytime an abuser is not respecting that boundary or line that a victim is drawing. Additionally, you'll see that we've included some of our findings around alcohol abuse and drug use. And while the percentages that we found don't differ drastically from the homicide cases that were reviewed, when substance abuse is combined with suicidal threats and ideations, plus access to a firearm, which we'll talk about later on in this webinar today, risk of murder-suicide goes up exponentially. So that finding feels really significant to us. The second trend that we explore is around the mental health of the abuser. And, you know, we've known for a long time as part of our project, it's been a finding that we've had that screening and referrals for suicidal abusers was a gap from the reviewed cases that we looked at. But our deeper dive into the murder-suicide cases reveals just how big of a missed opportunity this presents in our communities. And so getting to the heart of the connection of suicide and domestic violence lethality, we included this chart in the report. You'll find it on page 14. And this identifies and compares many of the common indicators we found through our research on the multiple overlapping factors for increased risk for suicide as well as domestic violence homicide. So we included a pretty comprehensive list of factors for both increased suicide risk and increased domestic violence homicide risk on this chart, and we bolded the ones that overlap. So you'll see the bolded ones on the screen. Some of the common themes that emerge on both of these lists include previous suicide threats or attempts, acquisition or presence of a firearm, presence of depression or substance abuse, any sort of relationship changes, a medical crisis, financial issues, impending accountability, and the recent death of a loved one. So given all of these overlapping indicators of increased risk, you know, it's really clear to us that there is more that can be done to integrate suicide prevention work and domestic violence work that we're doing, as well as integrating domestic violence prevention work into the suicide prevention work that's being done around the state. All right, further, we found in our reviews that perpetrators of murder-suicide threatened or attempted suicide prior to the fatal incident at over twice the rate of those who committed a domestic violence homicide. And signs of depression were also exhibited at a significantly higher rate in perpetrators of murder-suicide versus homicide, right? So that's pretty apparent when looking at the slides on the screen here. Just the number of really missed opportunities to intervene. These are folks who are exhibiting signs of depression, stating that they are suicidal or attempting suicide as well. So, but what we found is that only a third of perpetrators in murder-suicide cases were in contact with a mental health professional before the fatal murder-suicide incident. So again, this is a big missed opportunity in our communities to intervene when we see a suicidal domestic violence perpetrator, and to make sure that they're being connected to the appropriate referrals and intervention services. And these statistics really underscore the need to collaborate to make sure that mental health professionals are working with domestic violence advocates, and that there is a clear way to communicate and support each other whenever we see both issues coming up on both sides of the work that we're doing.
The third trend we'll take a look at in this report involves criminal interventions. As you can see here in this chart, fatality reviews revealed that 75% of murder-suicides involved previous calls to law enforcement, but perpetrators were charged in fewer than a third of those incidents. That discrepancy prompts us to assess for improvements that can be made in terms of our criminal justice response. Response outcomes from those previous calls varied amongst cases, but three major trends were identified within those calls. In some cases, no police action was taken. In some, victims were referred to seek their own criminal warrant, and in others, the responding officer took a warrant against the perpetrator. In terms of cases where no police action was taken, we discussed the fact that many victims rely on law enforcement strictly as a mechanism to stop the violence and do not intend to leave their abuser or want him to be incarcerated. In those cases, victims may appear uncooperative to law enforcement. They may recant, they may minimize the abuse. There's a variety of things that may go into that decision of the victim on scene speaking with law enforcement. So in many of those cases, no police action is taken. But perhaps the most common reason that no police action would be taken by officers responding to domestic violence incidents would be because the abuser has fled the scene prior to their arrival. So we take a close look at those circumstances, known as gone-on-arrival cases, in this section. And we highlight the fact that abusers who flee are among the most dangerous. As we've done in past reports, also, we continue to advocate against the practice of referring victims to seek their own warrants when probable cause exists. It is our continued belief that the process places victims at increased danger. As I mentioned earlier, perpetrators were charged in fewer than a third of the previous calls to law enforcement in these reviewed murder-suicide incidents. That is particularly important to recognize when we look at the fact that in those cases which resulted in arrest, abusers were also less likely to have their case move forward as charged. In this section, we stress the fact that it's extremely important that prosecutors and judges understand that mental health concerns and domestic violence are dual issues, and they should be treated as such. From our case reviews, it does appear that the existence of mental health concerns may have been considered a mitigating factor with regard to those domestic violence charges. So you can see here in the chart that only 32% of the reviewed cases pursued by prosecutors actually proceeded as charged. That's a reduction from the 41% which proceeded as charged in reviewed homicide cases. Using mental health as a mitigating factor for reduction in sentencing or dismissal of a Family Violence Act charge in favor of, say, mental health assessments, counseling, psychological or psychiatric evaluations, that does not necessarily reduce the likelihood of abuse in the future. Compounding all of that is the fact that victims may also struggle to recognize that domestic violence and mental health issues are not mutually exclusive. They may pressure prosecutors to drop charges or request that a judge modify a bond order to allow contact. So while we can all agree that mental health issues, where the perpetrator, that the perpetrator may exhibit, need to be properly treated, our judiciary must also be aware that in cases where suicide indicators are present, that lethal violence in domestic violence cases is a significant risk. We see that reduced likelihood of accountability played out statistically in our remaining data as well. We see that only 28% of perpetrators in the reviewed cases had contact with probation and or parole. That's 20% less often than perpetrators in the reviewed homicide cases. Also notable is the fact that only 20% of perpetrators have prior domestic violence convictions for charges involving the victim that they went on to kill, while 30% of perpetrators in the reviewed homicide cases had prior convictions involving the same victim. That being said, I suppose one of the biggest takeaways from this section is that the lack of past domestic violence convictions or a violent criminal history, both things that we know are often used by the judicial system as a factor in sentencing, should not be viewed as an indicator that lethal violence is less likely. In domestic violence cases where suicide factors are also present, we need to look at the totality of the circumstances as we're making those recommendations for sentencing. Moving on to our next trend, we also know that victims often pursue safety and accountability for their abuser through civil remedies. In fact, civil interventions may represent a victim's only course of relief through the court system when we factor in our discussion from the criminal section. In reviewed cases ending in murder-suicide or an attempted murder-suicide, 33% of victims were involved with civil or juvenile court systems sometime in the 5 years before the lethal incident. So that's a pretty significant increase from the 18% that were involved with those systems in the reviewed homicide cases. Also, as we previously mentioned, in 34% of reviewed murder-suicide cases, the parties were in the process of divorce. So we do know that that is where a significant portion of this civil court contact is coming from. 34% were going through divorce. Additionally, 30% of the victims in reviewed murder-suicide cases accessed relief via a temporary protective order, higher than the 20% who filed for a TPO in reviewed homicide cases. Sadly, 20% of the victims in the reviewed murder-suicide cases were killed while a TPO was in effect against the perpetrator, whereas only 11% of victims in the reviewed homicide cases were killed while their TPO was in effect. We know that TPOs are a great resource for increasing victim safety, but in a case where risk of suicide is present, additional measures must be incorporated into the standard language of our orders to increase opportunities for enforcement and to reduce the likelihood of future, possibly lethal violence. We discussed some of those options for improving our language and improving those accountability measures and the effectiveness of TPOs in the narrative of our report, as well as in the recommendations. It is also important to know that in 48% of reviewed murder-suicide cases, the victim and perpetrator shared children. I think Jenny mentioned that earlier. Children are often representing the only tie that binds the parties together post-order, so particular care must be paid to minimizing those safety issues that contact presents while you're establishing visitation, child support, and other arrangements that pertain to the children in these orders.
Okay. All right. So another section or trend that we highlight in our report this year is around family, friends, and the faith community. And we have, again, talked about this as a finding in previous years. We really see family, friends, and the faith community, coworkers, and colleagues, employers, as one of the most important systems in place to help victims of domestic violence and to hold abusers accountable, because oftentimes these folks know the most about what's going on in the relationship and in the lives of their friends and loved ones. However, what we also know from interviews is that oftentimes these are the folks who are the least prepared to respond and don't always know exactly what to do when they become aware that domestic violence is happening in the lives of their friends and family, as well as whenever any sort of, they don't know the signs of suicide to look for, the risk factors that exist there. Particularly in our interviews with friends and family members, we know that it's oftentimes difficult because of that lack of understanding to really grasp the severity of danger or risk that their loved ones are in. And they don't always connect the subtle signs of domestic violence to what they envision and are told domestic violence is, where, that really includes severe physical abuse. And so they're not connecting some of the controlling behaviors that are coming up and that we see as trending in the murder-suicide cases we reviewed. And so they're not connecting that to their understanding of domestic violence, and so they don't always know to look for help from domestic violence advocates and from the domestic violence community. So that's been a finding of ours for quite some time. What's significant and what makes this so much more important from our case reviews is in this chart that up on your screen right now, is just how much higher we saw in our case reviews of victims and perpetrators connected to the faith community prior to this murder-suicide. These feel so significant to us as a project as, either further support for intervening, for connecting with the faith community, for providing training on domestic violence signs, on suicide signs, and then how to respond appropriately and proactively when these issues come up in the faith community. And it's a really unique opportunity to provide support to victims and to hold perpetrators accountable within a faith community. And so just as a reminder, we did update the Safe Sacred Space resources that the project has been working on for several years. We now have a specific faith manual for faith leaders, as well as a task force training manual for task forces to conduct trainings with their faith communities and their local communities. Right. Again, what we found when we went back and broke the data up this way is higher rates of full-time employment for perpetrators and victims in murder-suicide cases. So again, this just reiterates our findings around domestic violence in the workplace trainings, reaching out to employers, talking about signs and symptoms of domestic violence, what to look for, how to intervene, and how to hold folks accountable and how to connect victims to safety through the workplace as well. So we also just want to draw attention again to the domestic violence in the workplace toolkit that we have, that we've created. That's available, both that and the Safe Sacred Space materials are available for download or order through our website, georgiafatality.review.com. All right. Mentioned this earlier, some of the special sections that we've included in our report, and so you'll see in the report this year a special call out on suicide prevention and intervention. So over the last year, the project has formed a partnership with the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, and the project staff was trained on a suicide and prevention and intervention model called QPR. And so this year we'll be utilizing that partnership that we've created and the training that we've received to conduct QPR gatekeeper trainings, which trains folks on how to spot and intervene whenever there's a suicide crisis. And so just a brief overview of the model. The Q in QPR stands for question, and so that section of the training really helps to focus on recognizing the indirect and direct cues of a suicidal person, sort of what to look for, how to interpret some common comments that suicidal folks or people who are considering suicide might say, and then how to respond to those, right? Because a lot of times we're not trained on the appropriate way to respond, very similar to when someone discloses that they're experiencing domestic violence. So it just provides some parameters and suggestions on how to respond and question further when someone makes some statements around feeling suicidal or depressed or, just not feeling like being here anymore. So really guides you through that process of questioning. The P in QPR stands for persuade. So this portion of the training really helps reframe what a suicidal person might be feeling or experiencing to provide them with hope, to connect them with reasons for not committing suicide, that there is help available, and really kind of reassuring them that there are other options than what they're considering. And then the R in QPR is to refer. So this is really making sure that you're aware of the appropriate referrals. You've got a way, even if you don't have them offhand, you have a way to identify appropriate referrals in your community to make sure you're linking someone who's been having these thoughts and feelings with the appropriate resources to help them work through that to get to the other side of that. So if you're interested in learning more about QPR, please contact us and let us know. This is also a really great opportunity to reach out to the local staff from the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities in your community. Invite them to the table, invite them to your task force meetings. You know, all of the staff at that agency has been trained on QPR. Just as our staff is, and it could be a really great opportunity to begin discussing the way to incorporate the work they're doing around this with the domestic violence work that your agency or the task force is doing in your community as well.
If I could just interject too, I think one other really strong takeaway from the QPR training is that this is being able to be utilized by people from all walks of life. This does not require any sort of specialty or background in mental health, social services, law enforcement, crisis response, anything. This is much like CPR is for, you know, assisting people that are having a cardiac incident, and easy to digest takeaway pieces that people can go out and implement and leaves them feeling more confident in their ability to confront indicators when they come up. So, you know, many communities, since we have such a varied group of people on the webinar today, some of your communities may already have crisis response teams, or, you know, for law enforcement may have been trained, you know, in a program specific to those responders. Ultimately, though, if you already do have that those advanced responses in place, one thing that this may help you do is reframe this in terms of bringing extra people on board to look at things like passive indicators of suicide crisis. So, for example, for you know, our probation officers or for advocates who may hear statements as simple as, "I just can't seem to catch a break," while we may just kind of brush those statements off, they may actually be a window into a larger crisis that, when trained upon some of these dynamics, you can pick up on that this may be an actual indicator of suicidal crisis. And QPR and other suicide prevention intervention models really talk to us about how to ask questions and not be afraid to confront those things head on.
All right. Another trend that we highlight in our report this year is around firearms. And so while most of us on the call today are aware that firearms and domestic violence do not mix, we can see from this data that you have on your screen here that firearms were used in murder-suicides at nearly twice the rate of reviewed homicide cases. So this is one of our biggest findings from our review of this data in our report this year. We know that access to lethal means is a risk factor for suicide and domestic violence homicide, and people who are injured by a firearm in a murder-suicide are less likely to survive that incident. In our report, we discussed how limiting firearm access for domestic violence abusers, specifically those who have threatened or attempted suicide in the past, may save the lives of victims, the abusers themselves, their children, and even bystanders that we've seen who are injured in the course of a murder-suicide in our state. So for several years, firearms has been a finding of our project, and we've advocated for limiting firearms access for domestic violence abusers, including TPO respondents and those convicted of a domestic violence-related misdemeanor. And so in Georgia, you know, our laws remain limited on direct provisions for firearms restrictions. However, federal firearms provisions restrict the ability of some abusers to legally possess firearms. So in lieu of state law that mirrors federal law, communities can apply the federal firearms provisions in Georgia, but it requires a savvy approach and a community really dedicated to reducing the likelihood of lethal domestic violence incidents in their local community. And so we've highlighted some of these approaches in past reports. And we continue to offer several additional tactics on how to address firearms and how to integrate some innovative tactics locally in your communities in this report.
The final section of our trends acknowledges that advocates have a critical role to play when it comes to safety for victims of domestic violence. They provide important services that most other helping professionals do not: risk assessment and safety planning. So we typically think of these services being offered during times of acute crisis, such as, say, when a victim contacts a hotline for assistance, when they enter a shelter, when they file a temporary protective order. But our case reviews have indicated that risk and safety actually fluctuate for victims over time. These variations point to a need for risk assessment and safety planning on an ongoing basis rather than solely during times of acute crisis like those that we just mentioned. This section focuses in part on the need to continue efforts to improve victim safety even after they have left the relationship. In part, this finding is based on the fact that victims in reviewed murder-suicide cases were out of the relationship in nearly 2/3 of the cases, as you can see here in this chart. In addition, when the parties were known to be separated in murder-suicide cases, the average length of time between the separation and the fatal incident was 5 months, although some victims in the reviewed cases had been separated for upwards of 10 years at the time of the incident. So that really speaks to the need to reevaluate our points of safety planning and risk assessment with victims. We also address improving our response to victims when they are the ones who are asking for assistance in obtaining resources for their abuser. Advocates are encouraged to receive additional training regarding the indicators of suicide and really need to have frank conversations with victims about that subject. Victim responses to the idea of suicide, we'll find as we work with victims one-on-one, can really vary significantly, and they really do require an individual approach to respond. Many victims do not even realize that their partner's suicidal threats or attempts can directly impact their personal safety. Some victims, for example, they may be fearful to leave the relationship because they believe their abuser will follow through on the threats of suicide. Some victims have received threats for that their abuser will commit suicide over many years. And so for those victims, their concern may have dulled or even been replaced with anger or resentment. So I think one of the most common questions in sort of getting out there now and talking to communities about, particularly the advocates that are working with victims who are experiencing this or they're having safety planning conversations around suicide is, when do we know when to take that seriously? When is an abuser serious? When do they mean it? When is this just being used as a mechanism for control or intimidation? And quite frankly, there's not a great answer to that. There's no one answer for that question overall. What we do need to do, though, is take all of those discussions seriously. We need to point out that those indicators are potentially very riskful for victims and their children. In addition to clearly discussing suicide and continuing safety planning even after the victim has left the relationship, this section also introduces the importance of offering services to surviving family members and witnesses to murder-suicide incidents. So as you can see here in this chart, witnesses were present in 63% of reviewed murder-suicide incidents. In these cases, 81 individuals were killed, but the impact of these incidents extends far beyond the incident itself. During those reviewed incidents, there were 141 individuals, including 36 children, who witnessed the murder-suicide. So there's a large pool of people we would not traditionally consider a target audience for our services or interventions who really do need supportive services to engage in out there. So the recommendations at the end of this section, I just want to acknowledge, do vary from those in the other sections in that they're primarily targeted towards domestic violence shelter, outreach, community, and prosecution-based advocates. However, that being said, we encourage readers from all disciplines to acknowledge that we each have contact with victims of domestic violence. Many of those may be outside the bounds of our professional lives. And so we hope that everyone will consider the recommendations in this section as you assess how you could improve your response to victims that may be experiencing crisis. The other recommendations which appear throughout the report have been carefully crafted after much hard work by fatality review teams across the state. That being said, the identified recommendations are not necessarily limited to the individual cases that were reviewed. They are solutions and recommendations that can be applied to any community, even those that have not conducted a fatality review. So the list of systems that you see here each have recommendations specifically targeted to them in the report this year. And you'll see that at the bottom of the list, we have even included some for ourselves. You know, Jenny talked a little bit about how we split our data this year and our different approach. And since we've taken that approach that varied from how things have been done in the past, we were unable to include all of the charts that have been featured in past reports in this year's book. So we do know that many of you use the data for training and advocacy purposes. So we did place all of those charts that you would typically expect from the report on our website in a downloadable format. You can find that document under the Resources tab on our website, and it's called the Supplement to the 2016 Report. It should be right there at the top of the screen. In terms of how we distribute the report, the project used to rely heavily on mailing out the reports, distributing about 3,000 of them by direct mail. But with the increases in digital technology, we are aware that many prefer to receive the copies electronically. Given that, only a small portion of our audience receives the report automatically now. Most of our readers receive a postcard announcement that alerts them to the report. So while we do hear back from many of the people who receive notice of the report, there's still a lot of work to be done to spread awareness about the information we're sharing with you today. So we're relying on stakeholders within your communities to help get this information out. So how can you help spread the word about what we're talking about? One method would be to consider making distribution of the Fatality Review Report a task force project. So you can contact us on our website or reach out to myself or Taylor directly. And as you work on your strategy, we would encourage you really to think broadly about who in your community would benefit from this information. Consider everyone from animal control officers to faith leaders, your Chamber of Commerce or human resources organizations. Don't be afraid to engage non-traditional systems as we, have these discussions around our state. If you have ideas of places for those of you that have, either implemented sharing the reports or have been considering how to get the word out, if you have ideas of places that you would want to share with other participants in the webinar, feel free to type that in the chat box also. We do want to just remind everybody, though, to engage your entire task force in the plan to distribute the report. Identify who you want to target as well as who will be delivering the reports to those people or agencies. And one method that task forces have taken is to include a letter of, to whoever they're delivering the report to, also inviting them to a task force meeting. So we'll share a template letter for task forces to use as they're distributing the reports, which may prove helpful as you're doing that.
And so beyond just helping us distribute the report in your communities and getting that into the hands of folks statewide, we also want to encourage you to make the Fatality Review Report a topic of one of your upcoming task force meetings. It's a great way to distribute the report as well, and to encourage folks to read it after you distribute it. Come back to the next meeting. It's going to be a topic of conversation. Let's talk about the recommendations. Let's talk about the findings. What applies to our community? How can we integrate some of this the recommendations and findings into the work that we're doing as a task force. And feel free, as you're doing that, if you're interested in doing that, to reach out to the coordinators, Nikki or Taylor. They have a presentation that they can do. They can help you prepare for that conversation. They can help with facilitating that conversation. So we're here for you if you want to take that on as a task force and have that be part of one of your upcoming meetings. And what we've heard and what we know is that Fatality Review is a really great tool to sort of galvanize a task force and to invite new stakeholders into your task force and into the work that you're doing, who you may have tried to engage before, they may have been resistant, they may have fallen away, they may have stopped coming. Fatality Review can really be a draw for folks to re-engage and to come back together, and it can really help lead the way in some of the initiatives of your task force. It has wide appeal, and so it could be also a great way to re-energize and invite some folks back to the task force who might not be coming anymore. And then as you read through the report, if you identify some particular recommendations that you'd like to work on, you might also identify folks who are missing from the conversation and from the table that would be necessary to implement that work. And so again, it's an opportunity for a broader discussion, for a jumping off point for some new relationships and partnerships in your community. And again, the coordinators of the project are here to help, as well as the commission. Our Family Violence Coordinator, Stacey Selden, can also help with some of that as well. So another way, beyond a task force meeting, we've also heard that Fatality Review is a great tool for a local agency or organization to make it a topic of your next staff meeting, to distribute the report to staff, send them a link to the PDF, have folks read it or read sections of it, come back, and at your staff meeting, it becomes, the topic of conversation. Talk about the findings and recommendations. How does it impact the work of your local agency or department or organization? What can you pull from it and integrate into the work that you're doing? How can it help you formulate a strategy for where you want to be, where you want to go in your agency? And what sort of internal policies and practices can be altered based on some of the recommendations to better serve victims and to hold perpetrators in the community accountable. It can be just a really great tool to have some really good discussions in your community, particularly with this topic. It really offers some new doors to open up with other agencies in the community with mental health and suicide prevention. And so we just encourage you to use it in a creative way. And please, as Nikki said, let us know how you're using it, because we always want to integrate that into what we recommend and the other conversations we're having with other communities throughout the state. And just briefly, some additional suggestions. We know that data is oftentimes used in grants and for additional funding. Use the data that's in the report this year. Use the supplement report that's been put together with all of our data that's online. And the recommendations that are in the report can also be really helpful for supporting a new innovative project you might want to implement in your community. Again, if you're doing any sort of strategic planning in your agency, it can be beneficial for that. Developing your task force initiatives, that can be a great tool for that, and through those conversations that you have as a task force. Fatality Review also, again, it's a really draws folks in for a lot of different reasons, and so for that it can be a great way to increase community awareness about domestic violence fatalities, about the recommendations and work that your community is doing in response to the Fatality Review findings and recommendations, that this is happening in our backyards. This is Georgia-specific data, which can be really powerful in engaging the community around that as well. And if you're working to develop a relationship with different media outlets in your community, we have a press release we've put together. A lot of folks in local communities have picked up on that and interviewed their local agencies about services and organizations about services they provide and trends they're seeing. And so again, that this is Georgia-specific data can be a draw for the media to get engaged and cover that as well. And we have a specific resource on that on our website called Domestic Violence in the Media Guide. It's a great tool to download and pass along to your media on how to cover domestic violence in an appropriate way. And okay, just a reminder again, we've referenced our website several times. We really want to drive our stakeholders there, because that's where you can download not only this year's report, but we have all of the reports we've published available for download there. You can order reports off of there. You can look over and download resources as well as order resources we've created as a project. And we have all of the webinars we've recorded in the past few years are available to watch free of charge at any time at your discretion on our website. A lot of them focus on implementation strategies of past recommendations, and the webinar today will also be available for viewing in the future on our website there if you want to pass this webinar along to anybody or come back and rewatch it. And we have a few minutes for questions. I know Taylor's been busy answering some of them directly, but please use this time to ask any questions that you have, and we will do our best to answer them as they come through. Let's see. So the link for the report, again, is georgiafataalityreview.com. So that's where you're going to be able to download the report and look at all of the resources that we've got available. Let's see. We don't have any printed postcards. That's a really great question and a great idea for the future, to pass out postcards in your community to direct folks to our website. We'll think about that for the future. Thank you for that idea. That would be really helpful. Instead of always having hard copies of the report, a postcard could be great.
Another option too, if you do decide that you want to host a meeting specific to this content, certainly you can put together a flyer or something, maybe give that out in lieu of a postcard, and then explain on the letter or flyer that you will have hard copies of the Fatality Review Report there at the meeting to distribute. Then you can just coordinate with myself or Taylor, and we'll make arrangements to get the reports to you at your meeting, as well as provide any other assistance that you may need to implement that.
We have a question here about what do we attribute the drop in fatalities from 2015 to 2016. So in 2015, we recorded 139 domestic violence-related deaths in our state, and in 2016, we've recorded 121. And so we really attribute that to, we had a lower number of familicides in 2016 than we did in 2015. In 2015, we had 4 familicides that had 4+ deaths in each of those incidents. And so that really increased the number of deaths that we recorded in 2015. So that's what we attribute the lesser number to for last year in 2016.
We also want to encourage those that are on the call that have, when you look at the copy of the charts, the statewide deaths, and you say, that number feels low to me, as you're looking at your community, I want to acknowledge that one thing that we do rely on is, in part, feedback from communities about deaths that have occurred there that we may not otherwise become aware of, particularly when we're talking about suicide-related deaths, that may be something that is not necessarily covered in the media, for example, so it may be less likely to appear on our radar. So we do regularly reach out to communities for feedback and to clarify, some of these statistics. But certainly, at any point, if you realize or are looking for more information about what's going on specifically in your community, feel free to let us know.
One question that came over is, do you ever study the cases that almost resulted in homicide? I've had several recently happen in my community, I'm guessing. We do. We have reviewed, and we have a specific methodology. We call them near fatality cases and near fatality survivors. So we've done 7 reviews like that, and it really is a case-by-case basis if the community wants to engage in that type of review instead. Let's see here. What do these task force members consist of? Who do these task force members consist of in the community? Task forces, family violence task forces are local coordinated community response teams that exist across our state. Typically, they're by judicial circuit. Some of them are county specific, and they're really diverse. Typically, we have domestic violence advocates, victim witness advocates, family violence intervention programs. We have prosecutors, judges, anyone, the faith community, mental health advocates, and counselors. Anybody who is working to do domestic violence work in the community, is invited to be a part of that task force. The commission does provide DFACS, school counselors, law enforcement. Thank you. Thank you for that. Those folks are also involved. So if you're looking for a local family violence task force to plug into, please visit the commission's website. It's GCFV.ga.gov. We have a list of all of the family violence task forces across the state on our website, and we have contact information and meeting times if known. If not, we have contact information. You can get in touch with the local chair of the task force in that community. If you can't find one, there's some communities that don't have family violence task forces. Our contact information is on there. Get in touch with us. If you'd like to start one, we can provide support to get that ball rolling in your community.
Good.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to
We're just reading over some of your questions. We want to make sure we get as many as possible.
Are the attempted murder-suicide, where perhaps only one party died, also included in this data? Yes. So the way that we separated the data out is that the murder-suicide data cases include those cases where one of the intended parties, the victim, either survived the injuries and the perpetrator did not survive the suicide attempt, or vice versa. That data is included in the murder-suicide data because that was really the intent of the incident, and so we felt like that was necessary to include in our different pools of data. The median separation.
Okay, looks like a couple other questions still coming in.
All right. So someone's reporting that they were able to deliver 25 reports at their task force at their last task force meeting, and that tomorrow they're delivering 25 at a faith training. That's a great use of the Fatality Review Report. Thank you so much for distributing that in your communities. All right. Looks like folks are using the charts from the Fatality Review Project at a local event that they are hosting. They made them into posters and hung them on the fence as folks were at that event. That's really great and interesting. If you've got photos of that, we'd love to see it. I think the charts are very striking, and folks respond to that kind of data, and so that's a great use of the Fatality Review data. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for anyone that's utilizing this data in a unique way, we would absolutely love to hear from you about how it's being used. Certainly modeling your use of the data may be of benefit to many of the other communities within the state. So we mentioned a template for the cover letter that that you can distribute with the report. I don't believe it is on our website, but we are going to send that out after the webinar with the slides. And certainly, if you have any trouble, you know, in the future and need that, reach out to us, and we can get a copy of that for you. We have, I believe it's 50 in each box. So when you're calculating, just let us know how many reports it is that you're looking for if you have a large event. And you can actually go on our website, GeorgiaFatalityReview.com, and put in there the requested number of reports that you're needing, as well as the date if there's a special rush that you need, for example, for an upcoming training or meeting. We'll do our best to accommodate that for you as well. Also, if you're interested, we have some of our key stakeholders have been very generous with the project. They've been willing to take a larger quantity to keep at their office to help distribute to those in the area. So certainly, if you're interested in acting in that regard, please reach out to myself or Taylor also, and we'll make arrangements to get you a larger quantity of reports. Let's see here. Okay, I think that may be about it. I know there were a couple of questions that came up that Taylor indicated that we would follow up with you individually about, but it's looking like the great majority of your questions have already been answered. Certainly feel free to reach out to myself or Taylor as you move forward. You can see here's our contact information. We're happy to assist in implementing any of this within your communities, with sharing information, with getting you reports, or with just strategizing how to have these discussions or who may be appropriate to bring to the table. Also, we are still accepting cases from communities that are interested in conducting a fatality review for this year. So certainly, if that is of interest to you, to your community, to your task force, please reach out to us so we can go ahead and start discussions about how you can become a part of this project in the coming year.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being on the call today, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.